The Seed and the Sower by Sir Lawrence van der Post. Chapter 4. The Growth of Nothing. My brother and I never spoke of Stompy again. The incident seemed to glide into place naturally beside the other unmentionable episode, and to form a pair of creatures waiting in the shadow of my mind for their native night to fall. There were even long periods when I succeeded in forgetting them altogether. I was aided and abetted in this by the fact that life afflicts the young with appetites and longings so violent and vivid as to lend reality to the illusion that they are permanent and that their satisfaction is purpose enough. I had my university to get through, then my law studies to conclude, and finally my own legal practice to set up. I did all this in a manner which satisfied the high expectations everyone had of me. True, towards the end of my law examinations, I was conscious for the first time of a slightly sagging interest in the mechanics of learning. From time to time, I wondered whether what I was doing was as important and urgent as it seemed to be. This may even have been noticeable in the results of my examinations. However, the change was so slight, and there were so many valid excuses to be made for it since I had so many interests, that it escaped both particular and general comment. Yet sometimes, in the very midst of my activities, and at all sorts of odd and unexpected moments, something would stir in the shadows. There was a movement of things long forgotten, as if to remind me that they were still waiting for their own nightfall. This awareness always was accompanied by a feeling of indefinable dismay, a startling of my whole being, and I never got used to it. Perhaps because what we call forgetfulness and neglect are the favorite sustenances of a certain part of ourselves. Suddenly, in a street crowded with traffic, my step would falter because some leopard light on a white wall reminded me of that morning when my brother and I rode out of the white gates to shoot on the other side of the hills on the Great Plain. Sometimes, at the climax of a complicated plea for the prosecution, I would find myself stammering and forced to play for time by drinking a glass of water I did not need, because the look in the black eyes of a handcuffed African prisoner waiting his turn in the dock reminded me, poignantly, of my own past with my brother. I told myself that it was absurd, even unjust, that such remote events should be allowed to keep such determined pace with my grown-up self. But none of these admirable and undoubtedly valid considerations influenced their behavior or their effect on me. They lived on from year to year, thriving apart from the mainstream of life within me, with a volition and dark reason all their own, and in time their self-announcements seemed to gain in vigor. But even worse than their disconcerting reappearances in a recognizable dimension of my spirit was their invisible subversion. As I grew older, I became more and more afraid of being either alone or unoccupied. I found out that my leisured moments were invaded by a strange uneasiness and bleakness. Particularly, I could not bear to be alone during the hours of mid-afternoon, for this period seemed to acquire its own bleak, masterful intent which lived itself out quite apart from me. I could no longer hear the wind rising, a sound I had always loved, without feeling unbearably sad because now my spirit seemed to be incapable of response. And the sound of a cockcrow, even in bright daylight, always gave me the feeling that I was groping in a crepuscular sleep gripped by a horror for which there was never a name. At the time, of course, I did not understand this sabotage in the invisible dimensions of my being. That came about only many years later. So I became a sufferer, denied even the comfort of knowing the name of this disease, and that feeling of uncertainty promptly planted its own colony of uneasiness on the mainland of my spirit. I became, if you like, a haunted person. Yes, I know the meaning of ghosts, and we who discount them do so only because we look for them in the wrong dimension. We think of them as a return of the bodily dead from their graves, but these dead have no need to return to life, for they are not the dead. As I see it, what has once given life to the spirit can never again be dead in the dimension of the spirit. So we mistake the shadow for the substance, confuse the reflection and the reality. Ghosts do not follow physical death, but rather they precede life. The only death the spirit recognizes is the denial of birth to that which strives to be born, these realities in ourselves that we have not allowed to live. The real ghost is a strange, persistent beggar at a narrow door asking to be born, asking again and again for admission at the gateway of our lives. Such ghosts I had, and thus, beyond all reason, I continued to be haunted. It made no difference that I worked hard, that I took good care never to be idle and seldom alone, that I did my duty conscientiously wherever I saw it clearly, and that I earned the envy and esteem of my fellow men in almost equal measure, that I took my vacations regularly in good company by the sea. This subtle chill of nothingness, of a cold, phantom presence silently trying and retrying the handle of my door, turned the warmth of my ardent living tepid. Yet, for many years, I doubt if any of my contemporaries suspected that anything was wrong with me. Occasionally, a woman would catch me out. In the midst of some cheerful gathering, she would ask with curious urgency, "What's happened? You look as if something awful had happened." I would laugh off the question, for how could I explain that I myself had no inkling of the truth, and that, in the past, when I had tried to track down the answer, it had led only to a jumble of unrelated visions. It was only the forward thrust of youth in me, and the support, visible and invisible, which the approval and expectation of our community gave me, which enabled me to carry on without wavering until I was 32. Then, for the first time, I was not merely saddened, but frightened. The spirit of play declined in me. I began to be increasingly worried that what I had achieved was without meaning, and my success merely an illusion. I would find myself waking up in the small hours of the morning and not knowing where I was or who I was. I would appear in court or attend a public function with the feeling that I was not really there at all. I would look at the church clock and think, but that's not my time at all. That's not the hour I keep. Or glance at the weathercock swinging complacently on its perilous perch and long to cry, "For God's sake, teach your kind to be as silent as you are." For the first time, too, the world around me began to indicate that it might have its misgivings. One day, an old acquaintance buttonholed me in the club to say with flattering solicitude, "You know, young fellow me lad, we all think you're overdoing things a bit. All work and no play makes Jack a dull boy. Why not come up north with me and put in a month's shooting on my ranch?" I could only protest and decline with polite gratitude. Impossible to explain that for years now I had only shot from necessity, for if there was one thing more than another which made my life seem like the endless repetition of a meaningless pattern, it was this automatic yearly recurrence of a long shooting excursion up north. Later, one or two elderly women, interested in my welfare, began to urge me to marry. "You're not looking after yourself properly. You need someone to take care of you." And then, with a touch of archness, "Don't leave it too long." I forced a laugh at their concern, and said that as soon as I met the right person, I wouldn't hesitate. But on these occasions, the question which always rose immediately to the surface of my mind was, how take on somebody else when I can't even know myself? Yes, the paradox which more than any other disturbed my nights was just that. My familiar self was a stranger to me, and the more deeply I felt this, the less inclined I was to visit my home. While my parents were still alive, I went occasionally to visit them, though always with reluctance. When they died, I sold the home in the village where I was born, and only once went to stay with my brother on the farm which he had inherited. Of that night, I remember clearly only one incident. One evening, after a dinner party, I asked my brother to sing for us. Before he could reply, the girl he was to marry said with surprise, "But you don't know, cousin, he never sings any more." The answer went deep into me like a knife stab in the dark. I never visited him again after that, although I was repeatedly pressed and as often promised to do so. I claimed pressure of work which in the past would have been a reasonable excuse. But at this period, the bitter process of cancellation within me had reached such a point that there were times where I could barely summon up the energy to get up in the mornings, or, once dressed, to get through the day. Often, the day over, I was unable to undress for bed. This distaste of life, joined to my fear of the distaste, lengthened in my heart like my own evening shadow cast behind me on a great yellow plain of the high veld. When at last, one September, our African spring came, it fell on my torn and tattered senses like a rap of a policeman at my own door with a warrant for my arrest. I was at my wits' end, and my wits, as my career showed, were not inconsiderable. At that moment, the war came. War is animal, not vegetable or mineral. It should be proclaimed as such by the beast blowing his own apocalyptic trumpet and sending scarlet heralds on coal-black horses to spread the news from one land's end to the other, so that all can recognize him for what he is. It came to us, however, quite differently. We read the news on the club teleprinter, whose main duty it was to keep us posted of the latest market prices, as we crowded round it that Sunday before lunch, glasses of wine in hand. I joined with the rest in the many expressions of horror that went up in the room. I, too, called it a crime against God and humanity. I warmly supported the oldest member when, tears streaming down his smooth pink cheeks, he called heaven to witness that the war was not of our seeking, and had been thrust on us despite the most honorable efforts to avoid it. But even as he spoke, and I agreed, I was aware of a barely perceptible sense of relief, a feeling as if an obstruction which had been damming the waters of life and rendering them stagnant had now broken through, and the stream was once more flowing fast toward the sea. Not that I want to exaggerate. This is an issue of war, and I want to be dead accurate. But it is not easy. In order to be so, I have to deal in a currency which the civilized Christian heart considers counterfeit, to pursue considerations to which no decent mind will wittingly own. Yet my impression that Sunday morning was that the company in the teleprinter room shared with me a lifting of tension. This, of course, had its legitimate aspect. For a long time the fear of war had been hanging over our heads. The removal of that uncertainty was accompanied by a certain relief. Yet, now that doubt was slain and the ancient theatre, closed for so long, was open once more, and yet another great drama of life and death was about to be acted, it was noteworthy how the feeling of having a definite part to play in a world premiere quickly invested the many persons in the room with a new sense of importance and an emotion of differences overcome. I saw two bitter enemies in the club who had not spoken to each other for years, simultaneously pledge themselves with moist eyes in an extra measure of wine. I myself felt the burden of meaningless which had been growing in me so alarmingly of late fall away, and the savor returned to my tongue. I felt a new reinstatement of purpose in my life, and a promise of greater significance to come. I stood at the window of the club. Alone for a moment, absorbed in my own thoughts, I listened to sirens and factory hooters breaking the Sunday calm to announce the news. Their tones of sinister hysteria affected the whole community. People walking in the streets suddenly swung out into a stride. Cars doubled their normal speed. All the leisurely Sunday traffic began to hasten. I saw a policeman overlooking flagrant breaches of traffic regulations, and all sorts and conditions of men who had never before mixed together now gathered spontaneously on the street corners, talking with extraordinary animation and gesticulating dramatically in a manner unknown in our community. Behind me, too, the club buzzed like a beehive. The sound reminded me of... I could only think of the noise in the quadrangle at school the afternoon just before the roundup. I felt my body stiffen as the finger of the implacable memory touched me. Then deliberately I forced myself to relax. The war, real fighting, I told myself savagely, would soon put an end to the shadow boxing that I had endured for so many years. Yes, I even felt a kind of grim satisfaction at the thought. I was just about to heed the voices of my friends calling me back to the bar when, among all those animated, fast-moving, and quick-changing figures without, my eye was caught and held by one inconspicuous scene. A woman and a child by her, waiting no doubt for a man, were sitting apart from the crowd in the swirling streets on an iron bench under the royal palm in front of our imposing gates. The woman had her arm thrown out protectively around the child. Her shoulders were shaking. Clearly she was crying. When I turned away, she was still crying. It was a scene I never forgot, and that went to join the other shadows in my mind, fighting for recognition. All that Sunday my mind worked with a vigor and a precision I had not known for long. I did not worry at all about my own personal safety. I had an idea I would be all right in battle and good at killing. Ignorant of the origins of this terrible need of life or death in the living issue that was upon us, I dismissed them. All my instinct for action and my confidence seemed promptly to return to me. I left the club after a quick lunch, went to my chambers, and wound up my affairs. I gave my clerks and juniors detailed instructions in writing as to how to carry on in my absence. It was nearly midnight when I finished, and yet, for the first time in years, I did not feel tired. I went home, still curiously exhilarated, woke up my housekeeper, and repeated my performance there. I did not get to bed until 4 a.m. Even so, I was up by 7 with a small suitcase packed with a few essentials. Soon after, still filled with this curious new eagerness, I presented myself at our military headquarters. I was nearly an hour too early, and a sleepy sergeant, impatient for his relief, angrily told me so. However, I insisted, with such an assumption of authority, on seeing one of the duty officers that he had no option but to fetch him. As a result, I was the first volunteer to be enrolled for the war in our city. In all this, I behaved as if in accordance to a plan worked out years before for just such an emergency. I never thought about what to do next. Each step presented itself to me in an unhesitating sequence of an apparently predetermined logic, even down to this question of volunteering and entering the army through the ranks. I do not suppose that I really anticipated being left there long. Perhaps if I had, I would have enlisted as an officer straight away, as it was easy to do in my country. Indeed, probably the more normal thing to do would have been quietly to apply for a commission and patiently wait my turn with the rest of my friends. But my instinct for the drama of the occasion, my yearning to keep close this revived feeling of purpose, would have none of that. It exacted this precipitate gesture from me, and persuaded me, at the same time, that this was the natural thing to do. The persuasion seemed more than justified when, that evening, sitting in the barracks in a brand-new uniform, I read in the evening newspapers, "City's youngest KC leads nationwide rush to the colors. Famous barrister joins the ranks." I was sent for the next day. I could then have a good administrative post for the duration in the Adjutant General's department. They told me it was the branch of the service which could best use my experience and training. But resolutely I refused all such suggestions and insisted that I would remain in the ranks unless I could be commissioned in the infantry. Didn't they know, I asked with a grin, that it was killing, not clerking I was after? I had my way, and within a few days was back in the club in officers' uniforms, standing round after round of farewell drinks, hearing from everyone both appraisal and approval of my behavior. Even my brother, in one of his rare letters, had written on the day war was declared, We've just heard the news, and by the time this reaches you, I expect you'll have joined up, so I want to hasten to wish you Godspeed. I can't, of course, go with you all. Someone has to stay behind and grow food, and I expect it's right that a bloke like me should be the someone. I can only promise you that the thought of what thousands of gallant chaps like you will be doing for the stay-at-homes will make me work harder than ever. I have already thought of a way of bringing new land under the plow that will double, if not treble, our yield. I don't expect you'll have time to come all this way to visit us, and I am sure it would be wrong for me to press you, but please remember, always, that you're constantly in our thoughts and prayers. Write when you've a moment, and God bless you, U-Boot. You see? In doing what I'd done, I was fulfilling even my brother's expectations of me. No wonder that, for the moment, I was composed, even content. Yet I never answered the letter. I put it off from day to day, and in the end merely sent him a telegram on the day I embarked. I shall pass over the weeks of training that followed, the detail of embarkation with the 1st Division of Infantry, and our voyage to the battlefields of North Africa. I do so not because that period is without interest, but because it is irrelevant to my story. I am concerned only with betrayal, with the seed of negation within me, with a particular botany both of my own and of the human spirit, and in that connection I have nothing further to add until I come to my first taste of action. The action was not much of an affair except to me and my battalion. My role in it, moreover, was of my own choosing and execution. For days our directors of intelligence had been complaining about the dearth of prisoners to give them information. We were new in the field and took their urging more seriously than we might have done later on. My colonel seemed profoundly bothered about the whole thing, and so I volunteered one night to take out a special patrol and collect the bodies intelligence wanted. The offer was accepted gladly, and again I was struck by how easily my mind planned and carried out the operation. It was as if I had done it all 1,000 times before. That, coupled with my lifetime's experience in stalking the game of my native land, made the task seem elementary and the success a certainty. After observing an aerial post of the enemy for some days, procuring a couple of aerial photographs of it, personally reconnoitering at night the ground between us and it, I crawled one moonless midnight out of our position, with a section of 7 hand-picked men behind me. Within half an hour, still undetected, we were close to our target. The tide of a not unpalatable excitement ran high in my blood. I felt rejuvenated, my emotions as fresh and vivid as the day nearly 20 years before, when I had stalked and killed my first kudu bull. I halted my patrol and turned on my back to rest, making sure we were all in full breath before going in to capture and kill the outpost whose low parapet was looming darkly before us, like the outline of the backs of a bunch of ruminating kine. I remarked that the stars, too, were participating in the venture, and trembling on the tips of their toes with excitement. In this strange northern sky, there were mostly strangers to me, and all appeared in the wrong places. But, as if for encouragement, there was my favorite constellation, the great hunter Orion, gliding smoothly with his red Indian swing through the black wings on the edge of the Milky Way, unheeding of the clear song and bright twitter of lesser stars on the bright stage before him. I do not think I had ever known a purer or more complete moment than I did then. I mention it because I think now that it was all part of the greater plan to perfect and refine the irony of what had to follow. All around us, the desert, so appropriately a setting for battle in the bankrupt spirit of man, was oddly still. As I lay there, the noise of an aeroplane coming fast toward us from behind the enemy lines broke in on the quietude. "We'll go in the moment it's overhead," I whispered to my men. "It'll drown the sound of our movements, but get this clear. You 3 come first with your knives. You others follow, covering with your guns. No shooting if we can help it." I turned over, knife in my right hand. I rose softly into position like a runner braced for the starter's pistol on the edge of the track. 3 dark shapes conformed beside me. The plane was flying low and fast towards us. Just before it was overhead, I said, "Now!" and leapt forward. The enemy position was only a shallow machine gun pit scraped out of the hard desert rubble. My hand briefly on the parapet, I cleared it at the run and landed in the midst of a platoon of sleeping enemy soldiers. My feet barely touched bottom when the aeroplane dropped a landing flare almost immediately overhead. Instantly, the shallow pit and its huddle of dusty little men and the desert far and wide around us were illuminated with a bright magnesium glare. The sentry, leaning against the bank by the parapet, was struggling out of a desperate sleep, terror on his face. In the strange phosphorescent light floating down from above us, I could see every line on his unshaven face. He was a small, dark man, his face broad and his eyes wide open to the horror quaking within him. Something in me hardened instantly at the sight of him, as if he were not a reality of war without, but a puppet in a shadow show against the ectoplasmic light of my own mind. He raised his rifle, perhaps, to protect himself, and he tried to call out, perhaps, that he was surrendering. The sound was strangled in his throat. I have always been exceptionally fast in my physical reaction to situations. Although this takes time in the telling, it all passed off in one clear, continuous movement. I leapt at him, and before he was clear of the bank, had ducked past his rifle, pinned him against the earth, and driven my knife into him beneath his ribs with a swift, upward thrust, and all my weight and speed behind it. For one infinitesimal fragment of time, a terrible stillness fell between us, the sort of stillness, no doubt, wherein God's monitors at their listening post at the exit of the world could hear a sparrow fall, or even the first faint footsteps of evil setting out on its labyrinthine way. In the midst of that stillness, I heard his skin squeak at the point of my knife, and then snap like elastic. A look like the brush of a crow's wing passed over his face, and for a moment he reminded me of my own brother. Flashes of visions of my brother, Stompy, the woman crying under the royal palm, came and went in my mind like children playing hide-and-seek in the twilight. They vanished just in time. My men were following my own example like automatons, attacking with their knives the terrified men coming out of their sleep with upraised hands. I had to stop them at once. More, I feared the fever of killing would upset the four covering us with their guns. Once they opened up, there would be no survivors, and our chances of getting back to our lines greatly diminished. As I ordered them to stop, the landing flare went out, and thank God a generous fall of blackness covered us all. We disarmed the 17 enemy soldiers still alive. We made them take off their boots and marched them in their socks deftly back to our lines. My men went behind, purring like kittens with their triumph. I went like someone profoundly preoccupied, walking unaware with one foot on a pavement, the other in a gutter, one mind content with my men in that moment, another hopeless and strangely defeated in another epoch of time. In that time gutter of my own, the prisoners in front of me seemed freer than I, a prisoner of myself and of my own jailer. Was this war waged in a cause of which I had had such ardent expectations, to show itself in my first encounter not to be the battlefield I sought? Would it not enable me to do the killing I needed? Was it about to cheat me merely into murdering enemy proxies of my own brother, and be but another turn of the same meaningless screw? Back in our lines, the colonel came out to congratulate us on the success of the venture, but for the first time I found praise hard to swallow. I was nearly rude to him. When my brother officers wanted to celebrate my first mention in dispatches, I could hardly force myself to drink with them. And so it went on. I got better and better at killing. In particular, I was so good at the kind of raid I have described that I was taken away from my battalion and set to plan and lead raids further and deeper behind the enemy lines. I came back each time impatient of offers of leave and rest, asking only to be kept active and employed. I volunteered for every difficult and hazardous operation. For more than a year, I was continuously engaged, either on operations against the enemy or busy preparing them. I gave myself no time for anything except war, hoping thereby to escape from my shadows, but they were too adroit for me. After waking in the midst of battle, the faces of men fixing their bayonets behind a sand dune, in the mindless sound of the cries they charged, in the sight of the enemy, caught in our concealed fire, wheeling like springbok, or at the sight of a peasant woman sitting with her child at the smoldering ruin of her home, right through the gateway of my deepest sleep and in the heart of my most tender dreams, the shadows followed. The shadows followed, deftly swishing and fluttering their long skirts as they passed. I do not know where it would have ended if, despite all my resistances, I had not been suddenly ordered out of the desert and sent on a special mission to Palestine.